Hey guys, welcome to chapter 33. We are still talking about animals. We're going to start with a very large group of creatures called invertebrates. These would be animals that do not have a true backbone, such as mammals, birds, and reptiles and the like. So although these may not be the creatures we think of most often when we go to the local zoo or we walk in the parks or the forest or something like that, this would be the vast majority of animals on our planet are invertebrates. So chapter 33 is all about an introduction to these invertebrates, and I want to go ahead and give you a heads up and tell you not to panic, because this is a long and lengthy chapter with a huge number of groups of these creatures, and we are going to take what I would call an abbreviated look at invertebrates. We have not the time nor the ability to go into great depth with these creatures, because if you wanted to study invertebrates in depth, you would spend multiple classes, multiple semesters doing so. So you will not need to memorize every group that's presented in this chapter, but I do want you to know some of the major groups, note what makes them alike or what makes them different, what are some of the characteristics of the major groups, and perhaps some well-known examples of some of the major groups. So I will try to highlight the things that I think are most important, and I don't want you to think that you have to memorize all the various groupings and creatures that are presented in this chapter, because I think in the time that we have that would be pretty much impossible. So let's get started with chapter 33, an introduction to invertebrates. Just a quick overview. A life without a backbone is what it says. Invertebrates, of course, are animals that lack a backbone, and as I already mentioned, these are the vast majority of animals on our planet. They account for 95% of known animal species, so we are far outnumbered by these invertebrate creatures. They occupy virtually every habitat on Earth. They are extremely morphologically diverse, and we will see a huge variety in body shape and style and habitat and things of that nature. And your book gives you a great example of an invertebrate that is so different from the normal everyday animals we think of. The Christmas tree worm is the one that it shows you, and it has these tentacles for gas exchange and feeding, and I'll show you a picture of it right here. So here is this little guy. Here's a clear picture of him, and the book says, what function do these red whorls have on this organism? I mean, this little creature, it does not look like any normal animal that I would think of, and it's actually resting on a coral, which is another type of animal we're going to talk about. So there's actually two animals in this picture here. Neither one of them look like anything that you're going to see at the Tyler Zoo or your Dallas Zoo or Fort Worth Zoo for the most part. So it says at first glance you might mistake this organism for some type of seaweed, but it's actually a particular type of segmented worm known as a Christmas tree worm. And these little whorls that you see are tentacles, and they act as areas of gas exchange, similar to the way that your lungs act. They allow for the gas exchange with the environment, and they also capture and remove small food particles from the water around it. And these tentacles emerge from these kind of calcium tubes that you see, and when the worm gets disturbed, he can pull those whorls, pull those tentacles back into these tubes that you see. So very similar. If you were to watch a video of this creature in action, to me it's very similar to if you saw Avatar and there was a type of like plant or fern, or truthfully it may have been an animal there on the world of Avatar, where when the main character touched them, they kind of spiraled inward, and they looked very much like this, and then he touched them and they quickly swoop, disappeared into the tubes. Well, here's a living creature that very much reminds me of that movie creature there on Avatar. If we look at the phylogeny of these creatures, remember, if you think back to the phylogeny of all the animals that we looked at previously in the last chapter, we kind of said that if you go all the way back to this ancestral common ancestor, then you have sponges, which are basal creatures. The porifera, those are sponges, and then everyone else falls into the eumetozoa, which is having true tissues. So only the sponges don't have any true tissues at all, no specialized cells that form groups of tissue. And then we could further divide once we get rid of the jellyfish and the sea anemones, which would be the Cnidaria. Then we get to the bilateria, the bilateral symmetry creatures, which would be pretty much everyone else, everyone from snails and segmented worms all the way down to the crustaceans, the arthropods, and the deuterostomia. Now, we don't have other deuterostomes, including, say, reptiles and mammals and everything on this list, even though they also have a bilateral body layout, because right here we're only including the invertebrates, the creatures that have no backbone. So here are some of the same terms and some of the same terminology that we used in the last chapter, except this is just cutting off in the top portion and we're leaving out all the creatures that we'll talk about in the next chapter, which would be all the ones with a backbone. Again, no way we could look at all the variety of invertebrates in this one particular short chapter, but if you look in your textbook on page 667, 668, 669, you can see sort of an overview of the huge variety of invertebrate creatures. And again, they make up 95% of the animals on the planet, so you would expect to find a huge number and variety of them. So the textbook does a good job of just kind of highlighting some of them, and we are going to go over a few of them. We're going to highlight maybe some of the ones that are most interesting or most well known, and we're going to try to stick to explaining some of the categories, what they have in common, what makes them special, that type of thing. So if you look in your textbook, you'll find mention of all sorts of creatures, some of which you're probably familiar with, such as jellyfish and sponges, and then we go on to segmented worms, everything from mollusk to octopus, some of those types of creatures that you probably are familiar with, including insects and the like, including, say, for example, on page 669, if you look up the tardigrade. The tardigrade is a little water bear, which is a pretty amazing little creature all by himself, actually kind of cute. And then we have the arthropoda, which would include the insects, the arachnids, the crustaceans. So a huge variety. We won't go into much detail on these, but again, in your textbook, page 667 through 669, you can see a few of these. So here we have everything from the most basic form, the porifera, which would be our sponges, to the cnidaria, which would be like a jellyfish, and then on down through other species as well. We're going to look at the flatworm. This is a beautiful marine flatworm, the platyhelminthes, the rotifera, which are pretty interesting. Some of these guys we're going to find are parasitic on other creatures. Like, for example, we could look at segmented worms like tapeworms, and we will look at some of those. Annelids, we'll look at some of those, and then mollusca, which would include clams and even fascinating creatures such as the octopus. And then going on to some of the others, there's your tardigrade, your little water bear that we were talking about, nematodes, which are little microscopic worms that live in the soil, arthropoda, which you're probably most familiar with because of the variety of insects. Echinodermata, sea urchins, again, just a huge variety. This would be in the deuterostoma. The deuterostomes would be more similar to us because the blastopore developed as the anus first, and then the mouth developed later in embryological development. So again, we're not going to be able to go into much detail on all of these guys, but we will try to hit some of the major categories and discuss some of the major differences and some of the things that make them alike. We're going to start with the most simple of these creatures, which would be Concept 33.1, the sponges. Sponges are what we call basal animals. They began, or their phylogeny goes all the way back toward the very beginning of the phylogenetic tree, and they lack true tissues. They are the only animals within the grouping that you would say lack true tissues. They are in the phylum Porifera, and informally they're called sponges. They are sedentary and live in marine waters for the most part. Most of them are ocean living. A few of them live in fresh waters, and they are so sessile or sedentary that, as a matter of fact, for a long time they were mistaken for plants. The ancient Greeks considered them to be plants. They range in size from a few millimeters to a few meters in size. So they'll be the first group we look at, the Porifera, and they would be, again, basal. They go way back close to the beginning of the common ancestor of all animals, and although this guy is not a scientifically accurate portrayal of them, he may help you remember Porifera, which is the sponges. They lack true tissue and very, very simple living creatures. They are suspension feeders, which means they don't really go out and capture their prey. They simply sit there in the water and capture passing food particles suspended in the water that flow through and around them. Water is drawn through openings or pores into a body cavity inside of them called a spongiceal, and then out through another opening called an osculum. So they don't really actively eat or hunt or take in food, basically they just let food flow through and into them in the water that they live. They lack true tissues, they have no organs whatsoever. As a matter of fact, they are so simplistic that some scientists even argue that they are more communal single-celled groups than true animals, because they're almost like they have no specialized tissue or material whatsoever. They're just a conglomeration of cells that kind of work together, but they do have a few slightly specialized cells so that not every single one of their cells is exactly alike. If you were to take them apart, first off, you'll notice they have no true symmetry. A sponge can be almost kind of any shape or size, and you won't find any symmetry. You won't find any way to subdivide and say, okay, well, here's how you can get a mirror image. Here's a good example called a vase sponge right here. If you were to examine their cells, they basically have two different types of cells. One of those is called a canocyte, and the canocyte is basically a cell that has like a little flagella, and it moves water through them to collect food and to aid in bringing in food and materials that the cells need. And then the others are called amoebocytes, and these little amoebocytes are indicated right here. And the amoebocytes sort of act like everything else that the creature needs. The amoebocytes can move around throughout the entire body. The amoebocytes can also change and become other kinds of cells as necessary. So really, they are very simple creatures. They're basically a mass of cells working together, and they have very few parts and pieces and no true organs, and you would consider them the most simplistic of creatures. And in many cases, you can chop off a portion of the sponge, and that portion can go on to live and form everything it needs to survive. And you could subdivide this sponge and pull it apart into 5 pieces, and those 5 pieces could live separately and apart from each other. So a very basic creature with just a few specialized cells. The conocytes are the flagellated collar cells. They kind of generate a bit of motion, a water current through the sponge to help bring in food, suspended food particles. There's kind of a gelatinous non-cellular layer between the 2 cells, so you get this mesohele, which is basically just kind of a liquidy material between the cells. The amoebocytes are the ones that I said are the ones that kind of move around and carry material back and forth. They play a role in digestion and structure. They are responsible, the amoebocytes are responsible for creating that kind of soft, pliable skeleton that you think of when you think of a sponge, that flexible skeleton called spongin. And that's the material that you actually use to wash your face with or shower with if you're using a true natural sponge there in the bathtub. Most sponges are hermaphrodites, meaning they can function both as males and females, and most of them do so sequentially. In other words, they will be male for a while, and then they will be female, and then they will be male, and then they will be female. They're not necessarily both at the same time, but they can act as either sex, so they are hermaphrodites. So again, very, very simple creatures, not much at all like any of the other animals that we're going to take a look at. So let's take a break right there. So these are the very first creatures, the most simple that you can get and still be considered an animal. And again, this would be the sponges, or as they're scientifically known, the porifera. So let's take a break. We'll come right back.